want you to close your eyes for a moment and picture the safest version of yourself you've ever been. For most of us, that image is bound up in school corridors, yellow buses, packed lunches, and the excited hum of a field trip morning. Teachers herded us into lines, clipboards in hand, and promised us a day of wonder museums, forests, quiet-walled aquariums where the deep sea pressed its wet face against our curiosity. But memory is a porous, treacherous thing, and sometimes what we think we lived through was actually a warning we were too young to understand. Tonight, I'm telling you 3 stories sent to me by adults who spent decades believing their childhood field trips were normal, until a crack formed in the plaster of remembering and let something terrible leak through. A boy who toured a textile mill that he would later learn had been a charred ruin since before his parents met. A girl who saw a motionless figure in a yellow raincoat standing behind a thicket while her classmates saw nothing but leaves, and a man who walked through an aquarium tunnel and met a creature that he now believes fed on the fear of every child who entered. These are not fantasies. These are raw, personal accounts of fractured innocence, and once you hear them, you may start questioning your own childhood snapshots with a new and chilling suspicion. Settle in, listen close, and let's pick at the thread. This is the compilation you asked for. When I was 10 years old, our 3rd grade class took a field trip to Harmony Textile Mill. That's the name I've never forgotten. In the cold edge of November, the permission slip had a drawing of a brick smokestack on it. And I remember being excited because my dad said he'd worked there for one summer back in the 70s. The bus drove for what felt like hours, the roads narrowing and the trees closing in until we lurched to a stop in front of a building that seemed to swallow all the daylight around it. It was a windowless horror of stained red brick, 5 stories high, with a single iron door hanging ajar like a mouth that had just stopped talking. Teacher, Mrs. Eberly, who had eyes that never quite landed on any one child, told us to stay together. But the moment we stepped inside, I was hit by a smell of wet wool and iron and something else beneath it, something sweet and spoiled, like fruit rotting in a closed kitchen. The factory was a maze of towering looms draped in gray sheets, conveyor belts frozen mid-turn, and dust motes spiraling in the beams of our flashlights. I remember the other kids' voices getting farther away as I stopped to stare at a row of mannequins lined against the back wall, faceless, painted the color of old teeth, wearing smocks stained with dark blooms. I turned to call out to Tommy Aldrich, but Tommy was gone. The whole class was gone, and the only sound was a drip somewhere deep in the guts of the building. I should have been scared, but a strange, dreamy calm had settled over me, and I walked through an archway into a room where the floor was black with old grease and a single bulb hummed on a chain. Beneath that bulb sat a chair, and on the chair sat a man in overalls, his head bent so low his chin touched his chest. His hands folded in his lap as if he were praying. I said, "Sir," and his head lifted, slow as a hydraulic press. In his face, still see it when I shut my eyes. His face was smooth, blank, skin pulled tight across the bone, with no mouth, no eyes, only the suggestion of features pressed into a surface that shone like wax. His chest rose and fell once, a wet, crackling breath, and then he pointed a finger toward a side door. I ran through that door and down a corridor that stank of ammonia, my sneakers slapping wet concrete. And I burst out into a gray afternoon light and collided with Mrs. Eberly, who grabbed my shoulders and said I'd been gone less than 2 minutes, that the class had just finished looking at the main floor. I was shaking too hard to speak, and on the bus ride home, I stared out the window and convinced myself I'd dozed off and dreamed it. For 22 years, that story lived inside me as a weird, half-forgotten nightmare, until a family dinner where my dad mentioned he'd never worked in any textile mill, and my mom laughed. It said the Harmony Mill burned to the ground in 1962, long before I was born. I felt the air leave the room. One called the school district archives, No field trip to any mill had ever been logged for my year. I tracked down Tommy Aldrich, who said he didn't remember me ever disappearing that day, and Mrs. Eberly had died of a stroke in 2005 and couldn't be asked. Frantic, I drove out to where my memory placed the building, and I found an empty lot choked with knotweed, a single charred foundation, and a small memorial plaque that read, "In memory of Samuel Hook, age 9, lost on a school tour. October 31st, 1962. The ground beneath me felt like it turned to cold syrup." I dug up everything I could. Samuel Hook had been part of a class field trip to the mill just 1 week before it burned. He wandered away from the group, exactly as I had, and he was never found. The official theory was that he fell into a maintenance shaft, but the fire erased all evidence. I have never been able to explain what happened to me on that November day in 1994. How I toured a building that had been ash for 3 decades. How I met a faceless man who pointed me toward an exit that may have once been a tomb. All I know is that the boy in the plaque wears my face when I dream, and that some field trips never let you leave. I was 8 years old when my second grade class went to Crow's Hollow Reserve for a nature walk. It was a state-run tract of second-growth forest with a single looping trail. It's a kind of place where the trees were tall enough to block the sun, but thin enough that you could always hear the road if you stopped crunching leaves. Our teacher, Mr. Delroy, had a clipboard and a checklist of leaves to identify. And I was at the back of the line because I'd stopped to tie my shoe. That's when I saw it. Maybe 30 feet off the trail, behind a dense thicket of blackberry brambles, a figure stood so still it could have been a fence post. But it wasn't a fence post. It was a person, tall and pale, wearing a bright yellow rain slicker, even though the sky was china blue and cloudless. The slicker had a hood pulled up, and beneath the hood I could see the lower half of a Fisa chin, a thin, colorless mouth set in a line that suggested great patience. I squinted, and the figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't do anything but stand there facing the trail, and I felt a cold thread pulled tight through my stomach. I called out, "Mr. Delroy, there's someone watching us," and he turned and squinted where I pointed, then said, "Just an old scarecrow or something. Keep up now." But it wasn't a scarecrow. I could see the way the slicker creased at the elbow, the way the fingers longed, too many knuckles hung at its sides. When I looked back after rounding the next bend, it hadn't turned its head. But I knew, with the certainty of an animal scenting a predator, that it was still watching. I said nothing else because no one else had seen it, and you learn quickly as a kid that seeing what adults can't is a fast track to being called a liar. The field trip ended. I went home. That night, I developed a fever so high, my mother said I spoke in a voice that wasn't my own about a man in a yellow coat asking me to come back. The fever broke, and for years, the whole thing became a faded, almost cartoonish memory of vivid imagination, my parents said. A nightmare brought on by too much sun, but the memory never fully dissolved. It sat in my mind like a stone in a shoe, and when I turned 26, I went back to Crow's Hollow. The reserve hadn't changed much. It's the same loop trail, the same blackberry thicket, though the brambles had grown thicker and wilder. I brought clippers this time, and I pushed through the thorns until I stood exactly where the figure had been. Behind the thicket, hidden by decades of neglect, I found a ring of moss-covered stones, the collar of an old well. The well had no cover. And when I leaned over the dark mouth with a flashlight, my beam caught something pale and small. I nearly dropped the light. 10 feet down, wedged against the curved stone wall, was a child's skeleton, dressed in the tatters of a yellow raincoat, the hood still up, one bony hand extended upward as if reaching for the rim. I stumbled back, gagging, and called the police. What they pieced together still makes my skin prickle. The remains belonged to a boy named Colin Vetter, age 7, who had disappeared from a school field trip to Crow's Hollow in 1987. He'd wandered off during a lunch break, and despite a massive search, he was never found. The well had been obscured by the thicket even then, marked on old maps but overgrown, and the search dogs had circled it, but the bramble barrier had turned them away. Colin's body had been there for 32 years, stone's throw from the trail where 100 field trips had ambled past. I had seen him at 8 years old, with a sign on my neck and a line of classmates in front of me. I had seen Colin Vetter standing exactly where his bones had lain unclaimed, and he'd worn the same yellow slicker his mother had described in the missing poster I now keep in a drawer. The figure I saw wasn't a man. It was the ghost of a boy, patiently waiting for anyone to finally notice him. I don't sleep well now, and I never walk past the thicket without looking twice. Once you've been seen by the dead, you spend the rest of your life feeling that gaze still resting on your back, gentle and implacable, urging you to come back to the woods and finish what the field trip started. The Oceanic Depths Aquarium used to be a jewel of our coastal town, a sprawling white structure shaped like a breaking wave, famous for its glass tunnel that let you walk beneath 100,000 gallons of Pacific water, while sharks and rays drifted overhead. In 1999, when I was 7, our entire first grade class went there, and I still remember the salty chill of the air conditioning and the way the light through the tanks turned everyone's skin blue. The main tunnel was crowded, so I pressed ahead on my own. Was an independent kid, hungry to see the creatures the pamphlets called innocence of the abyss. I remembered the carpet changing from teal to black, and I entered a second, much smaller tunnel that curved away from the main exhibit. No one else followed me. The glass here was thicker, curved like a bubble, and the water behind it wasn't blue, but a murky green-black that swallowed the light. At first, I saw nothing except my own reflection trembling in the glass, but then a shape began to coalesce from the murk, enormous and pale, pressing forward in segments. It had limbs, too many limbs, jointed in the wrong directions, and a soft, pulpous body that pulsed with a deep internal glow, like a lantern inside rotting meat. Sad, if you could call it a head, was a cluster of smooth, eyeless protuberances that all oriented toward me with a wet, sucking sound that I felt through the soles of my sneakers. I couldn't move. The creature drifted until it was pressed flush against the inside of the glass, so one of its appendages, a long, many-fingered thing with suckers that opened and closed like baby mouths, traced the outline of my body on the other side of the pane. Then it spoke, not aloud. The words bloomed inside my skull, bypassing my ears completely. A voice like grinding stones that said, "You are small and full of salt. You will grow. Come back when you are larger, and I will taste you properly." I remember a feeling of immense heat, a pressure in my chest, and then nothing blackness. I woke up on a bench outside the aquarium entrance with the juice pots pressed into my hand and my teacher patting my cheek. She said I'd fainted in the main tunnel from the heat and humidity, nothing more, and that the staff had carried me out for fresh air. I was shaky, but otherwise fine. And the class went home, but I knew what I'd seen. I tried to tell my mom, and she said I'd had a hallucination brought on by low blood sugar. Eventually, I choked the memory down, because that's what you do with impossible things. You hide them until the edges smooth over and it feels like a dream. Then, 3 years ago, I found a forgotten blog post about the Oceanic Depths Aquarium, which had shut down suddenly in 2002. The post claimed the closure was due to a containment breach in a sub-level exhibit called the Abyssal Grotto, an experimental deep-sea habitat that was never open to the public. Except, according to the anonymous writer, there had been a series of school tours that were mistakenly routed through it, and on each tour, at least one child had collapsed. I started digging. I contacted other people my age from my town, and a woman named Rachel admitted that she, too, remembered a dark tunnel, a creature, and a voice that told her it would wait until her bones were ripe. Another man, a year older than me, had drawn crayon pictures of a many-legged monster that his parents had dismissed as an overactive imagination. I eventually found a single grainy photograph archived in the city library's digital collection. A snapshot taken during construction of the aquarium, showing a massive acrylic tank being lowered into a subterranean chamber. And inside the tank, partially obscured by scaffolding, was a shape that matched my memory in every impossible detail. The photograph was dated 1988, and a handwritten note on the back read, "Specimen recovered from Kermadec Trench, depth 9,200 meters. Do not exhibit." The aquarium had been built around it, secret, locked in salt water, and for years it had whispered to children through 10 inches of glass, feeding on our fear, letting us go only so that we could grow and bring back richer terror later. I still have that photograph. I still feel the pull of the place, even though the building was raised in 2004 and the parking garage now sits where the wave-shaped roof once rose. Some nights, when the air is heavy with rain, I stand in my kitchen and feel that grinding voice nibble at the edge of my thoughts, asking if I'm large enough yet, if my bones are ripe, and I know with a slow, dreadful certainty that one day I'll drive back to that town, walk into the parking garage, and find the grotto waiting beneath the concrete, as patient as any abyss. Childhood is supposed to be a place of soft edges and dimmed fears. But for the 3 people who shared these stories, a single field trip peeled back the corner of reality and showed them something that was never meant to be seen. If these accounts unsettled you, if they made you glance at your own old class photos with a new prickle of doubt, please hit that like button and subscribe button. Keep bringing you true first-person horror that crawls under your skin. Leave your own field trip nightmares in the comments. Alright everyone. And the most chilling may find a home in a future video. Until next time, hold your memories close, but don't trust them blindly. Not everything you saw as a child was a dream, and not every field trip ever truly ended. Sleep tight.